Now, another research method that you might choose are surveys. So we're still selecting a research method, step 3. I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a survey is, and everybody's participated in a survey of one kind or another. These are widely used in all areas of the social sciences, not just sociology. Generally, a survey will ask people about their attitudes, knowledge, behaviors, opinions, perspectives. And because they can be utilized to seek such general knowledge, they fit pretty well in the social sciences. It presents a set of questions to a subject who will then provide responses, or what we would call data to a researcher, either in person, on the phone, and these days, the internet. Now, when conducting a survey, you need to know what a sample is. It is simply part of a group. It is the part of the population that the researcher is interested in analyzing. A population is the entire group. I'm going to go back and forth. Entire population, the little triangle, that's just the sample, the part of the population you're actually going to study. Why do we usually only study a sample instead of the entire population? For very, very practical reasons, mainly because of the time and the cost. Imagine the time involved in surveying an entire city or an entire community. The time involved in preparing surveys to be distributed, or calling everyone, or face-to-face interviews. No matter what structure the survey took, it's often simply too many people to deal with in an efficient manner. And in real research, this would be hugely expensive. It would be an inefficient use of whatever budget the researcher had, as well as an inefficient use of people conducting the research. So a sample lets you generalize the results of the entire population that sample is taken from, the entire population that sample represents. So the sample is representative of that entire population. But this is also why the manner in which a sample is chosen is extremely important. Because if it's not chosen properly, the results will be invalid. When choosing a sample, it is important to choose participants randomly, which means that whatever your target population is, everybody has the same chance of being chosen and the same chance of being excluded. So I want you to imagine for a second that I wanted to conduct research in North Bay regarding road maintenance. Whether citizens of North Bay feel the roads in this city are generally in good shape or not, and repaired in a timely manner when needed. So to conduct this research, I decide on a survey, and when I do, I choose my sample. I choose 3,000 potential respondents from the West Ferris area simply because that's where I live myself. Well, this is a problem. I can't generalize any results I get to represent all of North Bay as a whole because the sample was not chosen randomly from all of North Bay as a whole. Maybe they were chosen randomly from the one area, but they were all from one area and not the city as a whole. Different parts of North Bay were generally built at one time. I live in the West Ferris area, and this part of North Bay was, for the most part, built up in the 60s and 70s. Downtown was built earlier than that, which also means most of the roads in each area were constructed and paved at the same time. This is why, for a few years, it will seem like one area of town is benefiting from a lot of repaving, from a lot of sewer maintenance, because everything in an area is usually generally put in around the same time, and as a result, everything tends to wear out around the same time. So if I only focus on one part of North Bay's population, I will not be able to generalize my results to the entire city. This is why the manner in which a sample is chosen is important. It must be chosen randomly to represent the people that it's supposed to represent. So, as I said, making use of a survey like this can be done in several ways. It might be mailed to potential respondents, they complete it and mail it back. It could also be emailed. It could be a survey on a website. It could be completed in person somewhere. So, there are various methods of getting the survey to respondents. Another method of collecting information from a survey that sociologists can often use is face to face interviews, where you ask the questions directly, which might be more or less effective depending on the purpose of the research. Sometimes a face to face interview or an interview by phone really is the best way to obtain really complete answers and the most information. But if the research is focused on a sensitive or highly personal topic, that can backfire. So you have to really consider the situation as a whole and put yourself in the place of potential respondents. If somebody wants to conduct a survey about sexual activity of first year university students, and they decide the best place to do that is right on campus, most students would likely hesitate to provide complete and honest answers face to face with someone they may then see walking around campus or encounter in a classroom. So, you might think, oh, well, what's the big deal? So you might ask somebody, how old were you when you had your first kiss? That's not too embarrassing. But then you get more detailed. Have you ever had sexual intercourse? If yes, how old were you the first time? And how old was your partner? Where did it occur? Was it a planned experience? Was there alcohol involved? What kind of birth control did you use, if any? Why did you use that method? Did you ask your partner about their previous sexual experience, if any, prior to intercourse? Have you ever worried that you were pregnant or that you had impregnated somebody? State your age and number of sexual partners, referring to oral sex and intercourse. I suspect most university students would not want to answer my questions about that in person. And no matter what format is chosen, a survey necessitates creating a questionnaire of some kind. These can contain two different kinds of questions. Closed-ended questions are just that. Somebody can't just talk, they have to choose an answer that's being offered to them. But then you have open-ended questions where a respondent can answer in their own words. And there are benefits and disadvantages to both of these. Close-ended questions are the right choice in certain situations because they usually take much less time to answer. And that means you can get a lot of information quicker. So, to put this in academic terms, closed-ended questions make data collection easier. They are beneficial because less articulate and less literate respondents are not at a disadvantage with this kind of question, so they can still participate. These generally take less time to process, less time to analyze. And as a result of this, it can be easier for researchers to compare the responses of different respondents because they are comparing predetermined answers that don't have room for variation. But they're not the best choice for every survey or every survey topic because they can end up forcing the respondent to give simplistic answers to something that's really pretty complex and there's no room for elaboration. So they can suggest ideas that the respondent would not otherwise have thought of on their own, meaning that the basic format of a closed-ended question with preformed responses, they end up influencing the response so it's not entirely valid. In other words, closed-ended questions can bias people into giving a certain response because there's a list of suggested answers in front of them. And what these might do is suggest to the respondent the answers you're looking for. So people may be directly or indirectly influenced by the questions. Respondents can become frustrated if the answer they want to give is not one of the choices offered. And I think all of us have had this happen. The answer that best suits me does not fit with any of the little boxes, so I have to choose the one that is closest to my response, even if it's really not accurate for me. Some people can get confused or just frustrated if there are too many responses offered. Even something as simple as a clerical error, either made by the respondent checking the wrong box or the researcher entering the wrong answer when entering information on a computer, can make these questions invalid. Now, don't misunderstand me. Closed-ended questions are valuable, and they absolutely have a solid place in questionnaires for survey research. However, they also essentially stop the question, stop the conversation, because answers are limited without room for a more detailed answer. Open-ended questions also have certain benefits and disadvantages. Of course, on the positive side, the most important benefit of an open-ended question is that it allows the researcher to gain more insight into a respondent's thoughts, their attitudes, their ideas about the subject at hand, because the response is open-ended. The respondent can respond in any manner they want to. They can provide the answer they want to provide with as much detail as they want. They may provide answers that the researcher never would have thought of, never would have considered. They may voice concerns or attitudes or perspectives the researcher didn't consider. And with a closed-ended question, that information would never have been provided. So open-ended questions generally do provide much richer, deeper information no matter what the topic. And there's no researcher bias with the responses because no responses are suggested. However, there are also disadvantages to using open-ended questions. The biggest of which is that they can be much more time-consuming to administer and complete, and it can be much more difficult to analyze the data they provide because the responses are not neat, orderly responses from a list. An answer to a closed-ended question is exact. There's no variation, which makes it easier to understand it, to interpret, to summarize, easier to analyze it. With an open-ended question, you cannot code the open-ended answers. So, for example, do you like waiting rooms at the hospital? Check yes or no. An open-ended question would be, what do you like or dislike about the waiting room at the hospital? So you might get similar answers or you might not. In addition, with an open-ended question, somebody who is not very literate might struggle with them because a certain level of reading and writing is involved. No matter what style of question you use, of course, when developing a questionnaire, you want to do everything you can to make certain that you're asking the questions in a neutral way. Oh, sorry, I should have gone on to the slides. So you want to make sure you answer in as neutral a way as possible, in a manner that is not, so it's not a loaded question. So for example, do you consider adequate funding of overcrowded emergency rooms to be an important issue? Well, this is a loaded question because everybody's going to answer yes. Nobody's going to answer no. And because it's a biased question, the results of it are not valid. They cannot be taken as a true indication of what the question says it's measuring. So it's not as easy to define and design an effective questionnaire as it might seem. Seems like it would be simple. You know what kind of information you're looking for, and you're going to ask some questions, and that's it. But the researcher has to take certain things into consideration. So, for example, do you prefer greasy meat or healthy vegetables on pizza? Of course, that's a biased question. Now, your textbook makes 4 points regarding surveys that should always be kept in mind in order to make sure that your research results are valid and true, not reflective of bias. 1, excluding part of the population from the sampling frame, which I said. This is exactly what I was talking about with the example of road maintenance. You can't choose a sample in the manner I described and then generalize those results to an entire population. If you're going to generalize the results to a specific population, then you need to make sure you select the sample properly. The refusal of some people to participate in the survey. And this is a fact when conducting research. How often have you received a phone call from somebody conducting research of some kind and you just tell them you're too busy at the moment and hang up? Or somebody approaches you somewhere and asks if you have a few minutes to answer some questions and you say no. For a researcher, this can be very frustrating, but it happens and you have to expect it. Just because you ask somebody for information doesn't mean they have to give it to you. You may encounter respondents who are unwilling to answer questions frankly. And there's also a danger in asking people about something, usually somebody sensitive. But it could also be that you look at the question and just see a question, but they don't. They see something they don't want to be completely honest about. And they're thinking, if I tell this person I'm not completely satisfied with my experience at this hospital, it might eventually in some way make it back to the department I bring my child to, for example. And I don't want to offend anybody in case it affects our services. If I tell somebody what my personal thoughts are, it might have consequences for me down the road. If I tell this person about past sexual experiences or lack thereof, either way they're going to judge me. So some people will simply not want to participate. And then the asking of confusing, leading, or inflammatory questions, or questions referring to several unimportant or non-current issues. I think I've already touched on this. Asking somebody if they consider adequate funding of emergency rooms to be an important issue. This is a biased leading question with only one reasonable possible answer. It is a leading question. How about, do you prefer the natural beauty of hardwood floors or laminate floors? This is a leading question referring to the beauty of hardwood floors. In addition, and as simple as it sounds, if a survey asks too many questions that are just irrelevant, a respondent may not want to finish. So a whole bunch of busy questions that are not necessary, that just take up space and time, they will have a negative impact on the respondent.